You've been handed an idea so comfortable, so easy to believe, that you've quietly built your entire identity around it without ever questioning where it came from. That idea is simple but dangerous. Power only comes after permission. You were taught that before you can build something meaningful, before you can lead, create, or dominate a space, you must first be approved by an institution that validates your worth. So you chase the degree, the certificate, the official stamp that says you're ready, believing that this approval is the gateway to real influence. But if you look closely at the people who actually shape the world, the ones who bend reality and shift history, you'll notice something uncomfortable. They are not defined by credentials, they are defined by capability, and most of them didn't wait to be told they were ready. They didn't sit around waiting for someone to teach them step by step. They went out and took knowledge for themselves, piece by piece, driven by urgency rather than obligation. Society tells you that being self-taught is a weakness, that without formal education, you lack structure, depth, and refinement. But the truth flips that idea completely on its head in a way most people never dare to admit. The formally trained individual is often conditioned to operate within limits, solving problems that already have known answers, and following paths that have already been mapped. Meanwhile, the self-taught individual moves differently, stepping into uncertainty without a script, learning not for approval but for survival, for dominance, and for real-world results that cannot be faked. In a world that grows more unpredictable every day, the person who depends on a fixed curriculum becomes outdated quickly. But the person who can teach himself anything, at any time, under any condition, becomes nearly unstoppable, because his learning is not tied to a system, it is tied to necessity. If you're still here, it's likely because you've already felt this disconnect somewhere in your life. Maybe you followed the rules and still felt stuck, or maybe you walked away from the system because it felt restrictive and disconnected from reality, like running on a treadmill instead of actually moving forward. Deep down, you already sense that what you were sold as education is not always a path upward. Sometimes it's just a loop designed to keep you busy. And that instinct isn't wrong, because there is an unwritten system, a hidden framework that self-taught individuals operate within, one that allows them to bypass traditional gatekeepers and take control without asking for entry. The reason this approach is rarely encouraged is simple. It cannot be controlled. Systems depend on predictability, and a person who learns independently becomes unpredictable, difficult to manage, and impossible to contain within standard roles. By the time you reach the end of this, you'll start to see why traditional expertise is slowly losing its dominance, and why the individuals who learn quietly, outside the spotlight, are positioning themselves to thrive in the future. But to truly understand this, you need to pay attention at a deeper level, because this is not about reading more books or collecting more information. This is about fundamentally changing how your mind approaches learning, shifting from dependence to full intellectual independence. And that begins with the first shift, which is recognizing the trap that most people never even notice they are stuck in. Traditional education is built around what can be called just-in-case learning, where you spend years absorbing information not because you need it now, but because you might need it someday. You memorize theories, formulas, and facts without a clear purpose, storing them like data on a hard drive that you didn't choose to fill. Over time, this creates a passive mindset where learning becomes something that happens to you, not something you actively control. You sit, you listen, you absorb, and eventually you repeat what you were taught, but rarely do you apply it in a way that feels urgent or meaningful. The self-taught individual operates in the opposite way, focusing on just-in-time learning, where knowledge is acquired exactly when it is needed to solve a real problem. He doesn't study something because it's assigned, he studies it because without it, he cannot move forward. If he learns history, it's because he needs to understand power and strategy in the present moment. If he learns a technical skill, it's because he has an idea that demands execution immediately, not at some distant point in the future. This shift changes everything, because learning tied to immediate need carries emotional intensity. When something directly affects your ability to win, survive, or progress, your brain treats that information differently, embedding it deeply instead of letting it fade. History gives us powerful examples of this mindset, like Frederick Douglass, who saw literacy not as an academic subject, but as a tool for freedom. For him, learning to read was not optional or theoretical. It was a direct path to reclaiming control over his own mind in a system designed to suppress it. He found ways to learn despite restrictions, using whatever resources he could access, driven by necessity rather than structure. Now compare that intensity to the modern student who often sees learning as an obligation, something to get through rather than something to use. One approach is fueled by urgency and purpose, the other by routine and expectation, and the outcome reflects that difference clearly. The student completes tasks, but the self-taught individual extracts value, taking only what is needed to build something real. If you want to operate at a higher level, you have to shift your focus from collecting information to applying it. Stop asking what you should learn in general, and start asking what problem is directly in front of you and what knowledge will eliminate it. Because the world is filled with people who know a lot but do very little. Individuals overloaded with information but lacking the ability to turn it into results. The goal is not to know everything. The goal is to know exactly what matters and use it effectively. That's where the real advantage begins, and that's where the next shift takes over. Part 2. 800,900 words. Once you break free from passive learning, the next illusion you have to confront is even more deeply ingrained, because it sounds reasonable on the surface. You've been told your entire life to become well-rounded, to know a little bit about everything, to balance your skills so you can fit smoothly into society without friction. It sounds smart, even responsible, but in reality, it quietly pushes you toward mediocrity, because it spreads your attention so thin that you never develop true depth anywhere. You become competent in many areas, but exceptional in none. And in a competitive world, competence is rarely enough to stand out. The individuals who actually reach the highest levels rarely follow this balanced approach, and that pattern is not accidental. As Robert Greene explains through his study of mastery, the most powerful figures in history were not balanced individuals. They were intensely focused, often to the point of obsession. They didn't try to understand everything. They chose one narrow domain and went so deep into it that they uncovered insights others couldn't even see. They ignored distractions, skipped what didn't matter, and concentrated their energy so precisely that their work became impossible to ignore. The self-taught individual has an advantage here because he doesn't feel obligated to follow a standardized path. He is not trying to impress an academic system or meet someone else's expectations. He is trying to become effective in a specific area that matters to him. That freedom allows him to deliberately ignore large portions of information that would otherwise slow him down. He is willing to remain uninformed in areas that don't serve his goal, and that selective ignorance becomes a strength rather than a weakness. While others chase completeness, he chases precision, narrowing his focus until it becomes sharp enough to cut through complexity. He doesn't read everything, he reads what moves him forward, and that difference creates a level of clarity most people never experience. A powerful example of this mindset can be seen in Michael Faraday, who started with almost no formal education and lacked the mathematical training that many of his peers considered essential. In the structured world of 19th century science, he was viewed as an outsider, someone who didn't belong among the intellectual elite. But that absence of formal conditioning allowed him to approach problems differently, without being restricted by established frameworks. Instead of relying on complex equations, he visualized physical forces in a way that was intuitive and direct, seeing patterns that others overlooked. While highly trained experts remained confined to rigid models, Faraday experimented freely, guided by curiosity rather than convention. His work on electromagnetic induction didn't come from following a syllabus. It came from exploring ideas without the limitations imposed by traditional education. What made the difference wasn't what he knew, but how he approached what he didn't know. His lack of formal structure forced him to rely on observation, experimentation, and creative thinking, which ultimately led to breakthroughs that reshaped the modern world. This is where most people get stuck, because they are constantly worried about what they don't know. They focus on their gaps, comparing themselves to others who seem more complete, and that comparison creates hesitation instead of action. But the self-taught individual treats those gaps differently, not as weaknesses to hide, but as areas to navigate around. He doesn't pause his progress to fill every missing piece. He moves forward with what he has and fills in knowledge only when it becomes necessary. Instead of trying to become an encyclopedia, he becomes highly specialized in his own curiosity. He follows a single thread deeper and deeper, ignoring distractions until he uncovers something valuable that others missed because they were too busy looking everywhere at once. This depth creates a different kind of confidence, not the confidence that comes from knowing everything, but the confidence that comes from knowing exactly what matters in your domain. It allows you to operate with precision, making decisions faster and with more clarity. Think of it like focusing light, where scattered rays produce only a faint glow, but concentrated light becomes powerful enough to cut through solid material. Your attention works the same way, and when you direct it fully toward one target, the results become dramatically different. The problem is that most people are still trying to meet an invisible standard, shaped by years of conditioning that told them they need to be balanced, informed, and broadly knowledgeable to succeed. They measure themselves against that standard and feel inadequate when they fall short. But that standard was never designed to create exceptional individuals. It was designed to produce reliable, predictable participants in a system. Once you see that clearly, you stop trying to fit into that mold and start building your own path instead. The self-taught individual understands that excellence does not come from covering all areas. It comes from dominating a specific one. He chooses a direction and commits to it fully, even if it means ignoring everything else for a period of time. That level of focus is uncomfortable because it requires you to let go of the need to appear knowledgeable in general conversations, to accept that you won't always have something to say outside your domain. But in exchange, you gain something far more valuable. You gain depth that others cannot replicate, insight that cannot be easily taught, and the ability to operate at a level that separates you from the crowd. Over time, that depth compounds, turning your narrow focus into a powerful advantage. So, instead of trying to fix every gap, start identifying what truly matters to you and go deeper than anyone else is willing to go. Stop apologizing for what you don't know and start leveraging what you do know with greater intensity. Because the goal is not to be broadly impressive, it is to be undeniably effective in a specific area. And once you reach that level of effectiveness, the next shift begins, one that changes how you see authority itself. Once your focus becomes sharp and intentional, the next barrier you encounter is not about knowledge, but about authority. And this is where most people unconsciously hold themselves back. From an early age, you were trained to believe that truth comes from someone above you, a teacher, a system, or an institution that decides what is correct and what is not. This conditioning happens quietly through repetition, shaping how you think, without you even noticing it. Every time you asked for permission to do something simple, every time you waited for a signal to move, you were being trained to associate direction with authority, rather than with your own judgment. Over time, this creates a dependency that feels normal, where you hesitate to act unless someone validates your approach. You begin to trust structured approval more than your own observation, even when reality suggests something different. The self-taught individual breaks this pattern by shifting his source of truth from authority to results. He doesn't assume something is correct because it was taught. He tests it against reality and keeps only what works in practice. This mindset is uncomfortable at first because it removes the safety net that most people rely on. Without an external guide, you are forced to take responsibility for your decisions, your mistakes, and your progress without excuses. A clear example of this approach can be seen in Elon Musk, who chose not to follow the expected academic route when pursuing complex goals like space exploration. Instead of waiting for formal approval or relying entirely on established institutions, he studied core principles on his own and applied them directly to real-world problems. He didn't rely on accepted industry limits. He questioned them, breaking problems down to their fundamental components and rebuilding solutions from scratch. That approach allowed him to move faster and think beyond constraints that others accepted without question. If he had followed a strictly traditional path, he would have been taught the boundaries of what is considered possible within the system. But by stepping outside of that structure, he was able to explore possibilities that were not part of the standard narrative. This is what makes the self-taught mindset powerful, but also unsettling to systems that depend on consistency. A person who questions everything and tests ideas independently cannot be easily guided or controlled. He doesn't accept processes just because they are established. He looks at them critically and asks why they exist in the first place. And sometimes, that simple question is enough to reveal that many rules are based on tradition rather than necessity. This independent thinking is closely related to what Malcolm Gladwell describes when discussing outliers. It's not just about how long you practice, it's about how you engage with challenges, especially when you don't have a clear path to follow. When you teach yourself, every obstacle becomes your responsibility, and there is no one to blame when things go wrong. That pressure forces you to develop a deeper level of problem solving because avoidance is no longer an option. The average person often looks for structure to feel secure, preferring clear instructions and predictable outcomes, but that reliance can become a limitation, especially in environments that change quickly and require adaptability. The self-taught individual learns to create his own structure, adjusting it as needed rather than depending on fixed systems. He becomes both the student and the teacher, constantly evaluating his own progress and refining his approach. Over time, this builds an internal sense of control that most people never fully develop. Instead of waiting for direction, he initiates action, trusting his ability to figure things out as he goes. This shift also changes how you view external validation, because once you rely on your own judgment, the need for approval begins to fade. You stop measuring your progress based on recognition and start measuring it based on results. That independence makes you harder to predict and even harder to influence, which is why systems often discourage it. A person who no longer needs validation becomes difficult to manage because he is no longer motivated by the same incentives. He doesn't chase titles for the sake of status. He sees them as functional roles rather than sources of identity. This allows him to move more freely, using systems when they are useful and ignoring them when they are not. At this point, your relationship with structure changes completely, because you are no longer trying to fit into predefined paths. Instead, you begin to see those paths as options that can be used, modified, or replaced, depending on your goals. But this level of independence comes with a cost, because without external guidance, you must confront failure more directly. There are no grades, no standardized measures to soften the impact, only outcomes that reflect your actions. And this is where the next transformation begins, because failure itself starts to take on a completely different meaning when you are learning on your own. When you step fully into self-directed learning, failure stops being something you avoid and starts becoming something you use. And this shift is where most people fall behind without realizing it. In structured systems, failure is treated like a permanent label, a grade that defines your ability and follows you as proof of limitation. That kind of environment teaches you to protect your record instead of expanding your skill, to play it safe rather than take risks that might expose gaps in your understanding. You learn to chase correct answers instead of deeply understanding problems, because the system rewards accuracy over exploration. But outside that structure, failure loses its status as judgment and becomes information. It becomes feedback, raw data, that tells you exactly what is not working and what needs to change. And that perspective completely transforms how you approach learning. The self-taught individual embraces this process by moving through rapid cycles of action and correction. He tries something, it fails, he feels the impact, adjusts his approach, and immediately tries again, using each attempt as a step forward rather than a setback. This method resembles a personal version of the scientific process, where progress is driven by testing, observation, and refinement, rather than memorization. It is not clean or comfortable, but it is highly effective because it connects knowledge directly to experience. Consider someone who learned a practical skill through real-world exposure instead of theory alone. A mechanic who has spent time repairing engines in unpredictable conditions develops an understanding that cannot be replicated through textbooks, because his knowledge is tied to direct consequences. He recognizes patterns not because he studied them in isolation, but because he experienced them under pressure, where mistakes had immediate and tangible results. That kind of learning becomes instinctive, something that stays with him because it was earned through effort and correction. The same principle applies in modern fields, especially in areas that evolve quickly. A self-taught programmer, for example, often gains an advantage by solving real problems rather than only studying structured concepts, because those problems force him to adapt and think critically. While someone with purely theoretical training may understand systems at a conceptual level, the self-taught individual understands how those systems behave under stress, when things break, and when immediate solutions are required. That difference becomes clear in situations where timing and execution matter. What separates these two approaches is not intelligence, but tolerance for confusion and discomfort. The self-taught individual accepts that not understanding something is part of the process, not a signal to stop, but a signal to dig deeper. Most people encounter confusion and interpret it as a limitation, assuming that difficulty means they are not suited for the task. They step back, look for easier paths, or wait for guidance that simplifies the process for them. But the self-taught individual reacts differently, treating confusion as a challenge to overcome rather than a barrier to avoid. He slows down when needed, explores different sources, tests variations, and keeps pushing until clarity emerges. This persistence builds a kind of resilience that cannot be developed through passive learning. It strengthens your ability to operate in uncertain conditions, where answers are not immediately available and solutions require experimentation. It also accelerates your progress, because while others are waiting for structured instruction, you are already moving forward, making mistakes, and refining your approach in real time. By the time they begin, you have already gained practical experience that cannot be quickly replicated. Speed, in this context, is not about rushing, but about eliminating hesitation. When you stop waiting for permission to act, you shorten the gap between learning and doing, and that creates momentum that compounds over time. But this process does not stop at individual skills, because once you begin learning independently, you also start to notice something else. The boundaries between different fields begin to blur, and ideas that once seemed unrelated start to connect in unexpected ways. This realization leads to the next level of development, where learning is no longer confined to a single domain, but expands into a broader, more integrated approach. The self-taught individual begins to combine insights from different areas, creating something that does not fit into traditional categories. In structured education, subjects are separated and treated as independent disciplines, each with its own rules and frameworks. But in reality, most meaningful problems require knowledge from multiple areas, and solutions often emerge at the intersection of different fields. The self-taught individual recognizes this and begins to draw connections that others miss. He does not limit himself to one perspective, instead using whatever information is necessary to move forward, regardless of where it comes from. This approach is reflected in the work of Steve Jobs, who combined elements from different disciplines to create products that stood apart from conventional designs. He did not treat technology as separate from art or design. He merged them to produce something more intuitive and engaging. That ability to connect ideas across domains allowed him to create solutions that were not only functional, but also meaningful, setting a new standard for how products could be experienced. It showed that innovation often comes from integration rather than specialization alone. When you begin to think this way, you stop competing in clearly defined categories and start creating your own space. Instead of fitting into existing roles, you develop a combination of skills that is difficult to replicate because it is uniquely shaped by your experiences. This makes you less replaceable because you are no longer defined by a single function. You operate across boundaries, adapting your approach based on the situation rather than following a fixed pattern. At this stage, your learning becomes more strategic, focused not just on acquiring knowledge, but on combining it in ways that create new value. And as this process continues, it shapes not only what you know, but how you see yourself. Because once you step outside traditional paths and start building your own, a new challenge begins to emerge, one that is less about skill and more about identity. As your skills begin to compound and your independence grows, you encounter a psychological shift that most people misinterpret as weakness. But in reality, it can become one of your greatest advantages. This is the feeling of being an outsider, the quiet sense that you don't fully belong in the spaces you are entering. For someone who followed the traditional path, credentials often create a sense of entitlement, a belief that effort has already been validated, and that rewards should follow naturally. That belief can lead to comfort, and comfort often reduces the urgency to improve. The self-taught individual experiences the opposite, because without formal validation, there is always a lingering doubt. Instead of feeling secure, he feels exposed, as if he has entered a space without the usual signals of belonging. Most advice tells you to eliminate this feeling, to overcome what is often called imposter syndrome. But when used correctly, this discomfort becomes fuel, pushing you to prepare more thoroughly, to question your assumptions, and to refine your work beyond average standards. That constant pressure keeps you alert, preventing complacency and encouraging continuous growth. It forces you to rely on performance rather than reputation, because without external proof, your results become the only measure that matters. A powerful example of this dynamic can be seen in Abraham Lincoln, who had very limited formal education, yet operated among individuals with far more traditional academic backgrounds. Instead of relying on credentials, he developed clarity in thought and precision in communication that allowed him to stand out. His sense of inadequacy did not stop him. It pushed him to work harder, to think deeper, and to express ideas in a way that was both simple and impactful. That combination made his arguments difficult to challenge, even in environments where he was initially underestimated. This is the advantage of the outsider mindset, because it keeps you engaged at a level others often abandon once they feel secure. It drives you to focus on substance rather than appearance, building competence that speaks for itself over time. At a certain point, This internal pressure becomes self-sustaining, creating a cycle where effort leads to improvement, and improvement reinforces the desire to keep progressing. You stop looking for reassurance and start relying on your ability to deliver consistent results. This shift becomes even more significant when you consider how access to knowledge has changed. In the past, learning was controlled by institutions that limited access and decided who could participate, creating barriers that kept most people out. Today, those barriers have largely disappeared, replaced by open access to information through digital platforms. Knowledge that was once restricted is now widely available, removing the need for formal gatekeepers in many areas. This transformation should have made learning easier for everyone, but instead, it has created a different problem. With unlimited information available, many people become overwhelmed, unsure of what to focus on, and end up consuming content without direction. They move from one topic to another without applying what they learn, creating the illusion of progress without actual results. Without a structured path, they struggle to maintain focus, and that lack of direction slows their development. The self-taught individual approaches this differently by creating his own structure. Instead of relying on predefined paths, he selects information based on relevance, focusing only on what contributes to his immediate goals. He treats learning as a tool rather than an activity, using it to solve problems instead of collecting it for its own sake. This approach reduces distraction and increases efficiency, allowing him to move forward while others remain stuck in indecision. This is where the idea of permission begins to disappear entirely. You no longer need approval to start, to create, or to share your work, because the tools required to do so are already available. You can publish ideas, build products, and connect with others directly, without waiting for someone to grant access. This level of independence shifts the focus from credentials to capability, where results matter more than background. In this environment, the question is no longer where you learn something, but whether you can apply it effectively. If you can produce value, your path becomes less relevant, and your output becomes the defining factor. This shift is part of a broader transition toward individual ownership of skills and opportunities, where adaptability becomes more important than static knowledge. The ability to learn quickly and apply that learning consistently becomes a key advantage. Traditional systems struggle to keep up with this pace, because by the time new information is formalized and taught, it may already be outdated. The self-taught individual avoids this delay by learning in real time, adjusting as conditions change. He does not wait for official updates. He responds directly to new developments, integrating them into his work as they emerge. This responsiveness allows him to stay aligned with current realities rather than past frameworks. Over time, this creates a form of resilience that goes beyond specific skills. Instead of depending on one area of expertise, he develops the ability to adapt, to shift direction when necessary, and to continue progressing even when circumstances change. This adaptability becomes a form of security, not based on stability but on confidence in one's ability to respond effectively. It reduces dependence on external systems and increases reliance on personal capability. At this point, the path forward becomes a choice rather than a requirement. You can continue to rely on structured systems, or you can take full responsibility for your development and direction. Choosing the second path is not easy, because it removes clear guidelines and replaces them with uncertainty. But it also opens the possibility of operating without limits imposed by traditional frameworks. You begin to see that the real advantage is not in following a predefined route, but in creating your own based on what you want to achieve. And once you accept that responsibility, your approach to learning, work, and growth changes completely. You stop waiting, stop hesitating, and start acting with intention, building something that reflects your decisions rather than someone else's expectations. And in that shift, you move from participation to ownership, from dependency to control. The question is no longer whether you are capable of learning on your own, but whether you are willing to take on the responsibility that comes with it.